Why is belief in conspiracy theories possibly sinful, particularly, obviously, for a Christian? Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, which is the 9th commandment, the 9th out of the 10, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So clearly, obviously, I think it should be fairly obvious that lying is a sin, regardless of whether you now believe the Old Testament commandments are still applicable for the New Testament believer, because this commandment is actually repeated in several other ways in the New Testament. So even if you were to discount, which I think would be a very foolish thing to do, but nonetheless, I think there is a unanimous agreement amongst Christians in the world that to lie is a sin. And we will establish in the course of this video that I think it can be sinful to hold beliefs that are also based on lies. Webster's dictionary says on the word conspire, to join in a secret agreement to do an unlawful or wrongful act, or an act which becomes unlawful as a result of the secret agreement. Now let's say quite clearly up front, at least this is my view, not all conspiracies are real conspiracies. You know, criminals conspire to rob a bank, and then they go out and rob the bank, and the police generally will eventually, through gathering of evidence, find out who robbed the bank, and the people who robbed the bank end up in jail. So, you know, you could call that, at least at the outset, before the crime is committed, a conspiracy. But when we talk about conspiracy theories in this day and age, generally what people mean by that is things such as, you know, man did not land on the moon in the 1960s. This was all a fake. Or the earth is flat. And we're going to have a look at particularly some of these, because this is what my concern is and the reason for why I'm making this video. So to restate that, not all conspiracies are conspiracy theories as such. Politicians lie. That much should be obvious to anybody, whether you are on the left or the right of the political spectrum. Everybody recognizes that to some degree or another, politicians make either wrongful statements or outright lies. But of course, their motives are not always clear, and it is also wrong to apply a motive when you don't have any data to suggest a motive. So politicians lie, and sometimes even scientists lie. They are humans. They are subject to the human condition that the Bible would largely call sin. So not all scientists are perfect. But of course, that doesn't mean that because occasionally a scientist makes a false statement or actually lies, that therefore all scientists do so. So we should not therefore assume that because some politicians lie, all of them do, or that because some scientists make false statements, that therefore all of them do. And I would suggest, biblically speaking, that is slander and is therefore a sinful thing to do. No, but I can already hear many of you saying, but what about the COVID pandemic? Didn't the governments of this world conspire and lie during this period? Yes, but the question, of course, arises, did all do so? And I don't think there is any evidence to suggest that is the case. Now, it may be that many more did so than normally would have, but there is a long stretch from saying somebody has lied or somebody's even conspired to lie than that there is some grand conspiracy that has captivated every single politician, or virtually all of them. There is a huge difference in those two statements. I think the following statement summarizes what happened during the COVID period, and I think it actually simply confirms the biblical view of anthropology, as in the biblical view of man. Unelected bureaucrats used bad data to make bad policy decisions. And this obviously on a grander scale than normally occurs. So there's no grand conspiracy required in order to explain that unelected bureaucrats use bad data to make bad policy decisions. Now, I'm not saying it is impossible for a grand conspiracy, but you shouldn't believe such a thing without very solid evidence. And if the evidence simply points in the direction of that people use bad data to make bad decisions, that does not therefore say anything about their motives, nor does it say anything about some secretive organization that has captivated them. Sadly, the journalists of this world, who were traditionally called the fourth arm of government, i.e. their job is to expose the bad actors and inform the public, as in they're meant to hold the government to account. In my humble opinion, sadly, they largely failed to do this during COVID. And the reason, I think, is simply to be found in their having been captured financially by organizations like Big Pharma. And this didn't happen during COVID. That has happened for probably the last 30, 40, 50 years, gradually. And it is what we saw in COVID is simply the result of what has been going on for a long time. And because we didn't have such a grand pandemic in the world before that, therefore we weren't as aware of it as it to the same degree. Ultimately, your worldview depends on your view of God. When I say worldview, I mean, is the world that you look at some kind of captivated world where everybody who is in power is only making decisions due to some secret organization that has completely captivated the world and is running everything, and therefore it seems almost pointless to even vote in an election. If that is your worldview, that says something about the God that you believe in as a Christian, and whether he is in fact in charge or not, or how much he is in charge. In other words, how truly sovereign is the sovereign God of the Bible. Let's read Romans 11, verse 36. And I would recommend you read the few verses before that yourself, just to get an idea of what this doxological, as in this worshipful statement that Paul makes, what is it based on? But read those other verses yourself. We're reading chapter 11, verse 36. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. So from him means God is the source of all things. Through him means God is the means of all things, and to him God is the end of all things. In other words, neither Paul is really meaning what he says here in this very plain and I think very indicative statement that he makes about God, and it's a statement of praise that he's built on the previous verses and in fact the previous chapters in the letter to Romans. I think this is building up as a crescendo from chapters 9, 10, and 11. There's something very profound that Paul states about this. In other words, God is sovereignly in charge of everything, in charge of every human act, in charge of every human thought, in charge of everything in this universe. Famously, I think it was a theologian called Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch theologian, who said if even one atom was outside of God's control, then the whole universe would cease to be. Immerse yourself in the study of God's sovereignty in Scripture, and humbly said, I would recommend abandon false ideas of giving credence to devilish conspiracies and irrational ideas of man somehow being in charge of this world rather than God. Most of our problems come from falsely attributing power to man and not seeing God for who he truly is. Now, having said all that, sometimes so-called conspiracies turn out to be true. And the reason, as I suggested, they are exposed normally in any properly functioning society is due to A, good journalism, and B, also good people in the halls of government who are willing and courageous to blow the whistle when it needs to be blown. The issue here is this fringe idea that literally everyone who is in government and everyone who is a scientist is somehow in on some grand conspiracy. I'm going to give a few examples of this, and we're going to watch a few video clips just to demonstrate what I mean by this. The belief in the flat earth, as an example, is a rather modern phenomenon. Rather than being something that's really old and we've rejected it because it was old, it is actually, to be honest, something that came into popularity starting in the 19th century. You can do your own research to figure that out. And it is, I would humbly suggest, a rejection of basic science and the scientific method. Now we're going to watch a clip of a Christian who claims that the Bible is a book that supports flat earth.
Well, I've been a Christian for 30 years, so the Bible is a flat earth book. You have to take it literally. Like, for example, in Isaiah, when it talks about how the earth is like a clay wax seal that's stamped with upturned edges, that's just not some fancy story. That's a simile. It is like.
Right, absolutely. And in Isaiah it talks about too, and I'm a Christian, he who sits upon the circle of the earth. There's a difference between a circle and a ball.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
If you look at the original Hebrew, it means disc. There's over 200 scriptures in the Bible that point to
Greeks, men like Pythagoras, as an example, whom, if you remember your lessons in mathematics and algebra at school, you would have come across Pythagoras. The ancient Greeks, like him, believed the earth was a round sphere based on their observations. So by no means is it true that the ancient people of this world all believed in some kind of flat earth conspiracy. Contrary to some fringe elements, Christians throughout the last 2,000 years have also believed the earth is round. This is fairly easy to establish by looking at the works of the early patristic church fathers, by looking at the medieval church theologians and philosophers all throughout. The reformers definitely all generally believed in a round spherical earth, and of course the period of the Enlightenment that gave us much more scientific data that has led to the modern scientific method. The Bible is not a flat earth book. Now, there are several statements in the Bible that point to the Bible promoting the idea that the earth is round. We're not going to look at them now. And there are equally several that sort of could give you all sorts of different ideas, such as you could almost get the idea that the earth is a square that has four corners if you overly literalize poetic statements in the Bible. The Bible has several genres, such as historical narrative, parable, song, poetry, doctrinal teaching, pastoral passages. If you take poetry as an example, in a wooden literal sense, you can turn the Bible into a waxed nose. Context is paramount. And this concept, which is very prevalent in modern Christian people, is to proof text the Bible. In other words, take individual verses out of their context and just make them say individual truths that are completely devoid of the actual context of the passage. Let's look at just one example. Let's take Jude verse 3 as an example. It's a small letter towards the end of the New Testament. Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write, appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once delivered for all the saints. Now, without sufficient context, it could be said that Christians should take up arms, i.e. contend for, their beliefs. And if you don't believe me, let's take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 9. Here we're told, "Do not harass Moab or contend with him in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession." Can you see how over-literalizing is actually destroying the meaning of biblical texts? Because clearly the New Testament is profoundly against Christians ever taking up arms for anything. And the idea in the context of Jude, of course, has nothing to do with violently fighting for your beliefs. It is everything to do with understanding doctrinal truths of the Bible correctly and being willing to fight for them, but not through physical means. So to reiterate that, over-literalizing texts of the Bible literally destroys their meaning. The controversy in the Middle Ages, with Galileo as an example, was about geocentrism and not about whether the earth was flat. Imagine with me for a moment the following scenario. And while this is a bit of a contrived example, that's deliberately so in order to make a point. I'm out for a walk at the beach one morning, as I usually do. Today the beach is almost empty. In the distance, I see another person walking towards and eventually past me. This person has a dog, and oddly enough, this dog only has 3 legs. Imagine further, I conclude that this is a little odd, but think nothing more of it. And then a few days later, I see another person with a 3-legged dog, at which point I'm startled at the odds of seeing 2 people with a 3-legged dog in just a few days. Now, most rational people would conclude that this was a rare event, but nothing more. Now, imagine for a moment that I concluded that based on the evidence of seeing 2 3-legged dogs in just a short period of time, that therefore all dogs have 3 legs. And that all the pictures and films that I had seen of 4-legged dogs and all the school education in basic animal species were a part of some grand conspiracy to fool humankind into the false belief that dogs have 4 legs when in reality they only have 3 legs. This is the kind of irrational conclusions that people make who believe now that the earth is flat. There are many ways you can personally test for yourself whether the earth is a ball rather than a flat disk. And if you are someone who believes in that the earth is flat, I would strongly recommend you not get on an airplane to fly, let's say, from Australia to Europe, because you might find that you won't arrive, because all their calculations of how to make sure that the airline systems that fly this plane, because that's mostly done by computers, is all based on modern science. But anyway, one of the ways that you can personally test whether the earth is a ball rather than a flat disk, and this should be fairly common if you live anywhere near the ocean, if you watch a ship sail off into the horizon, you will see it disappear from the bottom up to finally seeing the top at the highest point. This is particularly so with a sailing boat or a ship as it disappears on the horizon. If the earth is flat, you would see the whole ship just get smaller and smaller, and it would not physically disappear. Even if you had a strong enough telescope, you could continue to see it for as good as the telescope is. Not so with the earth due to its curvature. So just to repeat that, if the earth is flat, you would see the ship disappear by getting smaller and smaller and smaller. As in its entirety, it would get smaller and smaller from every angle. Whereas when you watch out a ship disappear over the horizon, it goes down. You first see the bottom of the ship disappear, and gradually you see the top disappear, because that's due to the curvature of the earth. So were things like the moon all faked? We're going to watch another clip where someone claims this is so. And imagine just what is involved if that was true. I think it is just as I explained with the three-legged dog. And we're going to follow that on with another short clip about what would be required.
You do have to take everything with a grain of salt. That's why, because of my my multimedia background, I knew that all that stuff could be faked. You know, take it into Photoshop, take it into NASA. You can go out to NASA's site, you can download the original, right?
I already know what you're going to ask.
So you bring up the luminance on it, and you can see where it's cut out and pasted there.
They're showing us doctored images that are clearly doctored. The blue marble is a very famous image from 1972.
Why? Why would all these honest, hardworking people perpetuate this massive fraud? Why would they do this?
The Earth is flat is to charge the scientists in this world with lying, and at that in a grand sense. This is clearly slander, as there is no proof of this. Now let's see what Scripture tells us about slander. We're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 1 to 3. 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 1 to 3. So put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up unto salvation. If indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. Now it's interesting that this disclaimer is added at the end. In other words, obviously Peter is aware that there are people who are listening to him, who are obviously also sitting in the church, who have not tasted that the Lord is good. But ultimately, this passage tells us that we are not to be deceitful, we are not to be hypocrites, and that we are not to be slanderous. And I would suggest that if you give credence to somebody who is so, in other words, you not only listen to them, but you actually adopt false beliefs into your belief systems that are clearly not true, that are not based on evidence, and that are actually require slander at a grand scale, then you are actually in some sense or another also committing slander, even if not by doing it yourself. For further study, read Proverbs chapter 10 verse 17 to 19 and Psalm 15. And there are many other such passages. These are just a few examples. Proverbs 10, 17 to 19 and Psalm 15. In summary, it is a sin to lie. It is a sin to charge someone else with lying without evidence. And I would therefore suggest it is also, to some degree or another, sinful to hold false beliefs that are based on the notion of having charged somebody with lying without evidence. Now to round this up, I'd like to add a clip from a documentary that was made by a Christian apologetics organization in the UK on the moon landing. And bear in mind that many of the engineers and even several of the astronauts who were involved were Christian believers. So the people who are saying to the world, this is all fake, they are not only charging unbelievers with lying, they are also charging fellow Christians with lying, which is a very, very big accusation. And I personally think this is a completely and utterly untenable position to hold as a Christian. And I also think it's just simply damaging to the witness of Christianity as a whole, because it calls into question much of what Christianity is all about. In other words, it is in some sense slanderous towards the Christian gospel, and in that sense you are slandering the name of God and the name of Jesus at that point, which is a terrible thing to do. Now, I'm not suggesting that people hold these false beliefs do this deliberately. I think many people inadvertently hold beliefs without having really thought through the consequences. And part of the reason is why I'm making this video to, if there's anybody in our audience who holds such a false belief, that you really are challenged in some sense to reconsider and look at this belief from a rational perspective. So let's watch this last bit of the documentary clip.
Retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, word, go to continue PDI.
15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have commit. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Christmas 1968. The Apollo 8 mission was launched.
I was 9 years old in 1968. We were actually on our way to a Christmas event. And it was a clear night, stars in the sky. We were in the car listening as the broadcast from Apollo 8 came over the radio.
For millennia, we had looked up from Earth to the heavens above. Apollo 8 changed our perspective forever. We'd watched the stars. We'd watched the sunrise and the moonrise. But Apollo 8 showed us something unprecedented. This was Earthrise.
We take that shot for granted now, but over the last 50 years, there have been many pictures of the Earth rising over the horizon of the moon, but the Apollo 8 mission took the first one. It was the first time that man had seen the Earth from beyond the moon.
There's been plenty of sunrise pictures and moonrise pictures, but for the first time ever, as our Apollo 8 astronauts were skimming the surface of the moon and sending back those photos to Earth, which were fascinating in itself, for the first time ever in the history of the world, we got to see the Earth rise from the perspective of space. Truly fascinating and iconic. Yeah, and if we stop to think about it, it really was 50 years ago, the world's first selfie. I can say, as an aerospace engineer that's been blessed to be part of the human spaceflight program for over 30 years, that it takes tens of thousands of parts coming together on the launch vehicle and on the spaceship, and literally thousands of people part of a team to get to a point not only to launch this amazing engineering accomplishment, but to have a successful mission to get to space and returning our astronauts home safely.
To be able to calculate a precise aim point, to be able to fire the rocket motors at the right time, to be able to enter that aim point, to make adjustments as you were moving, had to be calculated very precisely. So all of those came into play as you were looking at the challenges of getting man to the moon.
But on Christmas Eve, 1968, the crew of Apollo 8 had their moment. With the whole world listening in, they decided to read from the opening chapter of the Bible.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good.
High above a fractured world, the astronauts spoke of a majestic creator, a God of order and peace.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. Dear men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
I can't help thinking of that on Christmas. The angel said, "Peace, goodwill to all men." 50 years ago, men went up in space in peace. 2,000 years ago, God came down to earth in peace. That's Christmas.
It's a connection that several astronauts have reflected on since. Colonel James Irwin put it like this:
God walking on the earth is more important than man walking on the moon.
For Irwin, his peacemaking mission to the heavens was a faint reflection of God's peacemaking mission to earth.
Step aside, babe. Let a star do this. That's all!
That's all, folks!
Can I go home now?